Hi. So, despite very popular opinion, I believe that Carol is the knight. As such, I wanted to make a video explaining why. So that's what this will be, going over the bigger points and getting my opinions and frustrations out there. And maybe someday I'll make more videos about this topic where I go into more depth. Also, side note, before 3 and 4 came out, I made a Twitter thread about who I believe the knight was. Parts of it aged poorly, but a lot of it holds up, I think. I'll link it in the description. Anyways, I'll start off with similarities between the knight and Carol. The knight's antlers are sharp, as are Carol's. Dessa's antlers, on the other hand, are round, like Rudy and Noelle's. Which makes it weird that so many people draw her with sharp antlers. In fact, both the knight and Carol have a ton of sharp-shaped language in general. With the knight, there's its helmet, its shoulder blades, its hips, its legs. And with Carol, there's her ears, hair, and eyes. Even her coat shows that she has broad shoulders, similar to the knight. I think that shape language thing applies to their weapons too. Carol and the knight both use sharp swords, while Des uses a bat, a blunt force weapon. Granted, the knight's sword resembles a bat when they first spawn it. But even then, the tip of the bat was sharp. Now, I will concede that the bat is a pretty good point for Des Knight. But the fact they use both Holiday's signature weapons means it doesn't really tip the scale in either way. Especially when they use swords constantly, and the bat showed up once. If Carol is the knight, I imagine the bat would symbolize her motivation, the search for Des. That grief and longing for her daughter turning into cold malice that she uses as a weapon against any who oppose her. And look at how the knight fights. It silently floats, making graceful poses when it slashes with a sword. I feel like the punk rock girl who chases Chris around wouldn't carry herself like this. She'd likely be much more animated and expressive. Her slashes would resemble a batter's swing. The knight is someone who is coldly silent as she cuts her opponent down. It's a lot more in line with how Carol would fight. Carol being a weeb could also mean she may know martial arts, which, this unused sprite resembles a martial arts block. Moving on to personality. Both Carol and the knight are cold, powerful characters. They're both controlling. They both attack people at the drop of a hat. And, contrary to popular belief, they're both smug. Which, by the way, isn't something Des is ever described as. Yes, Carol isn't smug all the time. But neither is the knight. While people tend to focus on these two scenes, much of the time, they don't show much character. When they are smug, it's usually in response to Susie being so gung-ho. It's a reaction to the specific circumstances at this point in the story. It's not how the knight always acts. If you want to argue that they can't be Carol because their personality and interactions with Susie are too different from hers, well, what of their scenes in Chapter 3? They don't smirk, they don't laugh at her, they don't pose like an asshole. Are these two different characters, too dissimilar to be the same person? Of course not. It's just a three-dimensional character behaving differently based on different circumstances. And Carol is not a one-note character either, who can only ever be mean and curt. She's allowed to have more sides to her. So, yes, I believe this cold, eccentric, chuny woman would flex on the child. Especially since Susie and her hate each other. This rivalry is something she also has in common with the knight. If they are the same person, it would mean Susie has an established dynamic with the knight's secret identity, something that would not be the case with Des Knight. Plus, I think Carol would have a strong reason to laugh at Susie's line here, "You can't beat us in the light world, can you?" Of course Carol would laugh at that. She owns hometown. She's above the police. These two kids wouldn't be able to stop her. Now, I don't think any of these points on their own are silver bullets. It's why I labeled this section superficial. But I think it's important to show just how much the two have in common. Before I get into the next section, I need to recap the knight and Carol's introduction scenes. At the end of chapter 3, the knight shows up out of nowhere. After the fight, they retreat to the bunker. After Susie leaves, the doors open on Chris, and the chapter ends. Next chapter, time skips to the morning, and Susie doesn't seem to know the doors opened. Now, going to the holiday manor, Chris gets a phone call from someone talking about dark fountains. Keeping Susie away from the guitar with the shelter code in it. Chris removing their soul. Undyne. And the church being the next dark world location. When Susie later gets the guitar, Chris gets a second call. That the caller will be right there. Very shortly after, Carol shows up, and yanks the guitar out of Susie's hands. And lastly, after Carol kicks everyone out, she tells Chris, "You are always welcome," with "you" highlighted in red. Here are my takeaways from what the story is trying to communicate. The knight's introduction leads us to believe they are either Des, because of the bat, or at least related to Noel, because of the antlers, depending on the player's lore knowledge. Chapter 3's cliffhanger leaves you wondering why the doors opened. If Chris will enter, or go get Susie. If this is the next dark world location. Chapter 4's opening doesn't answer what happened with the bunker, and you're left to wonder about it. The calls reveal Chris is allied with the knight. This explains why the knight would open the door to Chris, and why Chris would keep knowledge away from Susie. The caller is the knight. It talks about things only the knight and Chris should be privy to. Carol is the caller. A mysterious caller said they would show up, a new character shows up one scene later, and the first thing that character does is take the guitar from Susie. The one the caller wanted kept away from her. And Carol is fond of Chris, or possibly the player. So, by my estimation, this is roughly how the game wants you to view the knight's identity. Now to get into some counters to Des Knight. Many people say that Carol is a red herring for Des Knight. Des Knighters will often argue one of 2 points to support this. One is, Carol is not the caller. She's not involved in the knight plot. I'll talk about this later in the video. Here's a time stamp if you want to jump to that. The second point is, Carol is the caller, but Des is still the knight. Des, Carol, and Chris are working together. This idea has issues however. An aspect of Des Knight that not many talk about is that Carol would be shafted no matter how you spin it. Even putting the knight aside, she's clearly being set up as an important antagonist. Like, before you even meet her she's built up as this scary powerful figure. Which wouldn't really work if Des Knight is the one actually being terrifying, attacking you from the shadows, what have you. Like. It would just be immensely hard to compete with this. Furthermore, it's just hard to see these two working together. One is a controlling parent who always gets her way. The other is a rebellious abomination with nigh infinite power. Neither would want to submit to the other. And how does Asgore fit into this? It's implied he's working with Carol, and he's seen her conspiracy board. Does he know about Des, or is he being kept in the dark by Carol too? And what would the goal of this group chat even be if Des is already out of the depths? Just, like. Why have this complicated setup at all? Why do this character was working with the knight, twist again? Why have two scary controlling dear woman antagonists, who are essentially in the same role? Especially when they'd each take away from the other. Just have one antagonist who you can build up to be as menacing as you want, then have Des in her own narrative role. A big reason people believe in Des Knight is their appearance. They're emaciated, can shape-shift, and somewhat resemble a titan. The reasoning goes that, since Des was stuck in the depths for years, her prolonged exposure to darkness changed her into this. Now, this seems like a straightforward explanation. However, it's not an explanation the game even once implies or hints at. It's basically just a shot in the dark. As such, it's no more valid than any reason you can come up with for why Carol could look like that. It is not valid evidence that tips the scale either way. It doesn't matter how straightforward a theory seems. Unless it is founded directly on information from the game, it's no more evidence than a headcanon. Oh, also, there's this scene, where Chris imagines the knight taking off its helmet to reveal its identity. It gives precedence to the knight's form being due to armor they can take off. People have related some of the knight's poses to figure skating, and that Des has skates, so clearly this is an allusion to Des' knight having figure skated. I have two issues with this line of thinking. First off, the knight pulling these poses does not mean they actually had to have skated. It's just a visual reference, and for someone as heavily associated with ice as Carol, a fitting one. Secondly, I honestly doubt Des figure skated at all. She likely only had those skates to play hockey, as evidenced by her other equipment. There's not really any direct evidence she figure skated. She also is presented as something of a tomboy and is associated with more competitive sports, like hockey and baseball/wiffle ball. Figure skating seems kind of out of her wheelhouse. People argue Carol couldn't have gotten to the church, from the manor, in time to appear when Chris and Susie arrive. But she's been established to be incredibly stealthy and literally a ninja. She easily could have went out through the back, through the woods, and entered the church. And even though I 100% believe she could have made it there in time, even if Chris and Susie rushed to the church, we must consider that you're likely expected to explore the town a little. Especially since Susie suggests it. Also, the logistics don't really matter. It's not like Toby ever explained why Undine took hours to get to the Dreamers' house, or even pick up the phone. 'Cause it didn't matter as much as her just being there when the plot needed her. Plus, hometown isn't one-to-one with the place it represents. There's a lot of weirdness if you take it at face value. A car park with one spot for Toriel, backs of houses not connecting with the fronts, etc. I think trying to analyze the map to figure out the specific, off-screen routes a character may have taken, is folly. But if we're insisting on looking at the logistics of these routes, then how would Des have left the library unseen after making Cyber World? And yes, it was created during the day. Don't at me. Like, would people have not noticed a Titan abomination, a giant zombie, or a missing person just walking around? Did she take the secret underground Des tunnel? Speaking of weird commutes, how did Des escape hell at all? We've all taken Des's return as a given, but the depths clearly aren't easy to escape if it's taken her years. And, oh yeah, Des is supposed to be missing. Plots clearly stating that Des is not around. Not emotionally lost, but physically missing. It's like, why even set up Des's disappearance and the subsequent search for her as important plot points if we just skip over the time she's actually lost? Why write a story about a missing person, if you're just gonna have that person be in town, but oh now they're evil, and that's like the same thing, right? To me, it makes a lot more sense for the story to focus on the family of the missing person, and their reactions to it. 'Cause that's often all that's left of missing people. The uncertainty about what happened. The faint hope they'll be found someday. Their families. Those that have moved on. Those that haven't but still try to lead normal lives. Those that blame themselves for what happened. And those that are obsessed with finding her, at the cost of their own well-being, and the well-being of those around them. One of the more egregious points I've come across often for why people are against Carol Knight is this: it would be boring. Let me ask you something. What would the knight's motive be for its actions if it was Des? This is the character who gleefully attacks children. Who kills those that cross them. Who will bring about the end of the world. What reason is there to justify all those extreme measures, that Des had to crawl out of hell to see? I don't think I've ever seen a fan work give her a motive, and without one, her being evil isn't tragic or interesting. It's hollow. Carol, on the other hand, has a very clear motive. To find Des. Des disappeared into the dark, so creating dark worlds would make sense as a place to look. And this is a goal that she shares with the two other Knight-adjacent characters, Chris and Esgore. So there is reason to believe this in concept, but it is also just interesting. It's interesting to see a character mourn someone so much they would go through extreme lengths to find them. There's lots of emotion to it. It's horrible to lose a loved one. Especially if you believe it to be your fault. For allowing your daughter the freedom to wander the woods that she got lost in. For being there when it happened, and being unable to stop it. For failing to find her when that was your job. It would be very easy to see someone turning into a villain in these circumstances. Easier than if you were just stuck in a void for years. It also gives Chris a strong reason to follow the knight. They'd basically have to choose between their friends, and saving someone who's basically their older sister. Come to think of it, all of the main bosses have moments where characters stand up to them, for the sake of their loved ones. This would be a pretty great twist to that pattern, where standing up and defeating the boss would forsake your loved one. And a plot like this would not work if Des was the knight. If the person you want to save is attacking your friends, or killing people. It's a lot easier for you to just give up on them, than if they were an innocent third party. Same goes for Asgore. It would be so much more interesting if his goal of finding Des was actually necessary, than if he was just an idiot who didn't realize she was already in town. If he was not only aware of the knight's actions, but on board with them. If it meant finding the lost girl, and returning to when you were happy, then it's worth it. Man. At this point, I'm genuinely convinced the only reason people say Carol Knight would be boring is because they just decided they don't like her. Without taking any time to even think about how such a plot would go. Like. I can't stress this enough. We're comparing a grieving parent brings about the end of the world to find her missing daughter to Des is evil now or something. The former is a plot and the latter is angst bait. Lastly, we're coming back to the Carol is a complete red herring argument. Ahem. Twists are a narrative device where the plot is swerved into a different direction than the audience expects. Good plot twists swerve into a direction that is more interesting than what you expected. They also reframe the story upon rewatches. Poor plot twists are those done for the sole purpose of shocking the audience, often at the cost of logic or story. Like the end of Game of Thrones for example. Now. I think the argument that Carol's a red herring, she is not the caller, and is not involved with the night plot. She exists solely to throw you off Des Knight's trail, is a terrible point and would genuinely be garbage writing. It would mean Carol showed up hours earlier than usual for no stated reason, exactly when the knight said, it would be right there. Purely by coincidence. And when she arrives, she just so happens to snatch the guitar from Susie, the exact thing the knight was concerned about. And what would Des Knight have meant by, I'll be right there, if not showing up to the house? It can't just be creating the church dark world, because that does literally nothing about Susie having the guitar. Most of these details weren't even necessary to establish. Have Noelle just lose track of time, and that be why Carol shows up unexpectedly. Have the knight tell Chris to deal with it themselves, rather than imply Carol is the caller. Say Asgore called Carol to come over. It's just deeply, deeply contrived. And what does the narrative gain from you buying that Carol is the knight for 5 minutes? Especially when you already thought the knight was Des at the end of chapter 3. Is it going for a double bluff? And if so, what does that add to the story beyond a shallow, forced shock factor? And like, 99% of the fanbase has just accepted Des Knight as hard canon. So you can't possibly argue it to be good writing, because it would have been a failed red herring. Failed in its one job of convincing the general player base that Carol is the knight. It's especially comical when a Des Knighter lists a bunch of evidence that Carol is the knight, only to somehow come to the conclusion that, it's too much evidence, and that Des therefore has to be the knight. Because Carol would be too obvious or something. And this mindset that everything has to subvert our expectations, that things can't be as they seem, has plagued this fandom's theory community for years. The girl can't be Susie, it has to be Noelle. Chris has to be the knight, they can't be a generic RPG protagonist. Asriel can't be at college, he has to be dead. Ralsei can't be nice, he has to be a twist villain. Ralsei can't be the Prince of the Dark, it has to be Lancer. And on and on and on. It would be too obvious, too generic, too cliché, too boring. Sometimes when a game pushes you towards an idea, it's not because it wants to trick you. Sometimes it's because that idea is just true. Deltarune is not subversion slop. Toby is not Scott Cawthon. It also just misunderstands how Deltarune does twists in general. It doesn't do them by insisting that X is Y, even forcing details just to bury the lead, before doing the exact opposite as a giant heel turn twist. For one, it doesn't contradict what it sets up. Rather, it plays off that information. For example, Ralsei was not evil, he genuinely is that nice. And because we saw his genuine character from the beginning, when we learn more about him, that only deepens his character. It shows us new angles to his behavior and actions. If it turned out his being nice was a complete farce, then replaying Chapter 1 would have just been one big, haha remember when we trusted him, over and over. No depth, just staring at the cardboard cutout of a character, before the actual character walks out from behind it, chapters later. And another thing is that, the quote-unquote red herrings, in Deltarune, work because they go somewhere. They either give us important information or lead into interesting plot points themselves. The end of Chapter 1 didn't mean Chris was evil or a murderer, but it did establish that they are a separate person from the player who isn't aligned with us. The end of Chapter 2 didn't mean Chris was the knight, but it did mean they were working for them. In retrospect, it's honestly an issue Chris Knighters were right to bring up. The idea that Chris was the knight would be more interesting, than if they were just a normal kid who wanted to go on another adventure with Susie. The expected path, in this case, would essentially have just repeated what the end of Chapter 1 already established. You only serve to weaken your story and waste time by adding these subtle nods that Carol is involved, if she's not. By putting so much emphasis and menace to a nothing character. By having a red herring whose plot goes nowhere interesting. Fuck. Thank God fans aren't writing this game. Lastly, I want to talk about how Carol Knight fits the game thematically. Control is one of the main themes that we're opposing. The Knight clearly embodies this, as they control Chris, have an unwinnable fight, and oppose the heroes fighting to stop the prophecy. Their fountains also make King and Queen more tyrannical than normal. Carol also embodies this theme, being both a controlling mother figure and the mayor of hometown, one who is above the police. Interestingly, Carol seems to not have been so controlling in the past. Looking at Dessa's room, it's very personalized, which you wouldn't expect if Carol was a hard-ass back then. Des also had a lot of instruments and sports equipment, which aren't cheap. I'll come back to this point in a bit. Des on the other hand, is very freedom-coded. Look at the lyrics for Raise Up Your Bats. She advocates for standing up and fighting, even when you're losing and the future is doomed. It's the same thing Gaster cheers you on for when you oppose the Knight. Additionally, she and her friends would often wander around the woods, which is what led to her going missing. This, I believe, is why Carol became worse following her disappearance. She blames herself for allowing Des so much freedom, and now keeps an iron grip on her life. Carol being a mother, I believe, also makes her a more fitting character to be the main antagonist of an anti-control game compared to Des, a punk older sister figure. While older siblings can hold authority over younger siblings, parents usually hold more. Parents being antagonists or not being the greatest is also a recurring theme in Deltarune. Even well-meaning ones like Toriel or Jerson are shown falling short of being perfect. Lastly, there's a recurring theme of people longing for the past. Even Susie, when she's talking about how she wants every day to be the same as the present, to just keep on going on adventures with her friends without end, says this. Specifically the last part. That in the end, we can always go back to the way things were before. With that in mind, it makes sense for the main antag's motivation to be the same. To find Des, and go back to when the holidays and dreamers were close. Deltarune's ultimate message regarding the past and future isn't really clear to me. But to take a shot in the dark. Carol's mentality is one of assurance. She follows the prophecy, she knows exactly what will happen, and she'll get what she wants. And what she wants is to recreate the past she lost, by any means necessary. The mentality we're fighting for, is more like what Gerson talks about. One of creative liberty and freedom. About not knowing what's ahead. It's risky. I mean, we've seen what happened to those who try to break their strings. But it's worth it. To craft our own future. That our choices do matter. That we can reach a better ending. Finally reached the end of this video. Here's where I think both knight candidates stand evidence-wise. I tried my best to keep this script short, but man, it just really got away from me. Even so, there's topics about this I want to talk about, like these. But that'll be for future videos, maybe. Or never. Thanks for watching and always bet on Papyrus Knight.